Homelessness is an existing issue in India. Many of them die without fulfilling their dream of having a home. The situation in rural India, especially considering the state like Bihar, people struggle to have a shelter. Working with people and knowing their real stories, some of them remained with me because their struggle for survival was too difficult. To help someone to build a house, we needed to raise funds. It was a challenging job to find some generous sponsors. When I shared this story with Emeritus Bishop John Baptist Thakur, he introduced me to Mr. John. When I wrote him about the people here, he gladly agreed to share the blessings God has given him. The generous support of Mr. John actualized the dream of many poor families of having a house. House was constructed for Lahasya Devi from Narhana village. She belonged to Musar community, also a widow. She lost her husband at very young age. She was left with 5 children. Among them, one child is physically and mentally challenged. She struggled to find 2-time meals for the family. In this situation, she married one of her daughter at the age of 14 so that one mouth is less to be fed. During extreme winter and monsoon, their life was most difficult. Water dripping from the roof kept them up for many nights. When I talked to her about building a house, she looked at me out of disbelief that someone can be very generous to her expecting nothing in return. I explained her about the generosity of Mr. John in sharing what God has given him. 2 rooms house was constructed, now the family have safe shelter. Shobha Devi from Vijaypur comes from Ravidas family. She is deaf and dumb from a young age. Her husband died, leaving her only son. After her husband's funeral, she was put out from her in-laws' house and she returned to her parents' home. But for her brothers, she was an added responsibility. So they made a small hut for her and asked her to stay separate. She goes as a daily wage worker and manages her life. But after few years, the house needed repair and it was almost falling. To stay in such a house was very dangerous. She lived in a constant fear and no one could understand her fear because she being deaf and dumb. It was only visible in her eyes if you had eye to look at her. It was a real need to build a house for her and today she has a proper roof above her head. Bhikari Manji and his family lived in a small 1-room house. He was the bread earner of the family. One morning he began to experience severe pain in his leg. He took medicine and felt bit relieved of his pain. But next morning he realized it was difficult to walk. He was taken to a hospital in Patna and diagnosed with bone tuberculosis. It affected his spinal cord and in a couple of days he was paralyzed and bedridden. The family went through the darker days of their life. It was difficult for the family to find 2 meals in a day and also support the medication expenses. So we provided the medication support and along with that we also provided monthly food supplements. But their real problem was they stayed in 1 room and didn't have a toilet or kitchen. It was an emergency to have a separate kitchen and toilet in their home. So a kitchen and toilet was made for the family so that a bit relief can be found. On my way to village, I often met a lady with a small child staying near roadside in a shed made out of old clothes. The living condition was very poor and the child looked in a very poor health condition. I took time to talk to her and in my interaction I could figure out she is not mentally stable and her husband is very old. They survive in rag picking. Seeing their living condition, anyone would feel it's a need for them to have a house. But the problem was they didn't have a land to construct the house. So we talked with few village people. One of them agreed to give a small space near the roadside to construct a temporary house. So we constructed a temporary house for them. At least they have a shelter where they can sleep without being affected by the seasons. A social change can happen when a society gets educated. In rural India, quality of education and the need to create educated society is a far reality. The children needs a lot of motivation to introduce them to the world of literacy. The basic education center collect the children in the village and initiate them to study. Dostnagar, Bintoli, and Lodhipur. Dalit village where children who were not going to school attended non-formal classes. The main problem that we faced was that they don't have a room for the classes. Initially, we started the classes under the tree or in an open area. But extreme weather conditions disturbed the class. Also, teaching in the open area and keeping children under discipline was a difficult job for the teacher. Room was constructed for study center and more than 50 children attended the class. Among them, 70% of the students attended the regular classes. Today, when we look into their eyes, they have a dream. Life of a young widow in rural India can be compared to a heap of problems. Most of them are illiterate. Being a widow is never in the hand of a woman, or a woman does not want to be a widow. The woman struggles to bring herself into the new role by facing grief and sorrow in the situation that is suddenly in front of her. Most of the time, they are put out of the family situation and given the worst place to stay. These places can never be repaired or they can never make a better house for themselves. We have responded to some of these situations. Sangeeta was born in the backward Dalit family. Her tiny shanty accommodation, 8 sisters, 2 brothers, and parents beside her. Daily wage was the only source to meet their both end needs. Sangeeta too was not an exception. As soon as she reached her adolescence age, her parents decided to marry her off. The customary practice in this region was the young girls carry less bride price compared to the older ones. They have better value in the marriage bargain. By the 4th year of their marriage, her husband met with an accident and died on the spot, leaving 2 small children behind. Her in-laws tortured her mentally and physically, made her starve and went through a very dark days of her life. Nevertheless, the harsh reality of the life offered on the platter toughened her muscles to fight against all odds. But the real problem was she didn't have a house to stay. It was a need to have a secured home for her so that she can live peacefully and no one could walk into her house to torture her. So a small house was built for her. Neetu, Poonam's and Tertari's stories, also not different from others. They are also a young widow with 2 small kids lost in the world where everyone is busy in building up their own kingdom, fulfilling all their wants and desires. But their cry for existence reaches nowhere and they continued to stay in misery, looking for a ray of hope. In this hopeless situation, Mr. John came to their life as a ray of hope who offered a helping hand to meet one of the basic necessities for the person to live. That's a house to stay. It is a response to few families where their little earning they began to build a house. But after many years also they couldn't complete the work. Their dream of having a house remained unfulfilled. Partial financial help was given to them to complete the work. Leelavati comes from a very poor family and her husband Ramdas Ram is a daily wage worker. From their little saving they began to build a small house. But when the work began, his wife fell sick and they have to spend a lot of money on medical expenses. Due to this situation, they couldn't complete their work. Financial help was given to them. Ravi Kumar comes from a poor family and he is the only earning member in the family. He has many mouths to feed. He had just small house and accommodation for everyone was difficult. So he began to make an extension of his house. But when he began the work, his father fell ill and died. Due to this, he could never complete the work. Financial aid was given to complete the work. Lalandas and Jharkhandi also share the same story. Both of their house was collapsed during the monsoon. Jharkhandi even lost his son when the house was collapsed. They didn't have a house to stay, so both of their house was constructed. We express our gratitude and thanks to Mr. John for being the supporting pillar that we needed during our struggle for survival. You have always been someone kind to people in need. We have nothing to give you in return other than our assured prayers. Thank you very much.